Good afternoon and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Wednesday, October 11th at 2 p.m. and we are here to resume the hearing in docket number 2023-121-E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin and Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, and present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. As we left off yesterday, I believe, well, first of all, any preliminary matters to take up before we begin? Hearing none, I think we left off where Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress are up next.
Thank you, Chair Belser, members of the Commission. Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas called J.W. Oliver to the stand.
Mr. Oliver, if you'd raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Mr. Oliver, please state your name for the record.
My name is J. William Oliver.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy Business Services as Managing Director of Grid Systems Integration. In that role, I'm responsible for multiple departments focused on grid edge customer program operations. These include battery energy storage, demand-side management, customer clean energy programs, and transportation electrification.
Thank you. And have you prepared or caused to be prepared under your supervision direct testimony of 20 pages that was previously filed with the Commission on September 22nd, 2023 in this docket?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or additions to your pre-filed direct testimony this time?
I do not.
And if I asked you the same questions here today, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Have you prepared or caused to be prepared under your supervision two exhibits labeled as Oliver Direct Exhibit 1 and Oliver Direct Exhibit 2 that were previously filed with the Commission as attachments to your pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or additions to your exhibits?
I do not.
Chair Belser, at this time, I would move that the pre-filed direct testimony and exhibits of Mr. Oliver be admitted into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Oliver's pre-filed direct testimony will be admitted as if given orally from the stand. The two exhibits, Oliver Direct Exhibit 1 and Direct Exhibit 2, which accompanied that pre-filed direct testimony, will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as Hearing Exhibit 8 and received into the evidence of this case.
Thank you. Mr. Oliver, have you also prepared or caused to be prepared under your supervision responsive testimony of 4 pages that was previously filed with the Commission on October 3rd, 2023 in this docket?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or additions to your pre-filed responsive testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions here today, would your answers be the same?
They would.
And Chair Belser, at this time, I move that the pre-filed responsive testimony of Mr. Oliver be admitted into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Oliver's responsive testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally.
Thank you. And Mr. Oliver, have you prepared a summary of your direct and responsive testimony?
I have.
Would you please deliver that at this time?
Certainly. Good afternoon, Chair Belser and members of the Commission. In my direct testimony, I build upon the previous comments filed by Duke Energy in this docket and address 14 specific items related to electrification of the transportation sector that were identified by the Commission in Order Number 2023-596. Taken together, my testimony, the company's comments, and the comments submitted by other parties in this docket recognize that electrification of the transportation sector is complex, will necessitate significant planning and action, and will require utilities to play a central role. These efforts will be key in ensuring that South Carolina will have a strong foundation in place as electrification of the transportation sector continues to progress. Given that adoption of EVs in South Carolina remains at an early stage, implementing solutions now can ensure EV adoption is managed in a way that creates opportunities for all customers. These efforts must account for a range of factors relevant to the company's operations, including load forecasting, impact to the grid, EV charging availability, pricing signals, and cost recovery. Given the various aspects of the company's operations that will be impacted by EV adoption, the development of regulatory policies that focus on grid readiness, managed charging options, and the removal of barriers to customer adoption of EVs will be critical to address challenges associated with electrification. The companies are already designing tools and programs independent of this docket that begin to address these challenges while considering impacts to both program participants and non-participants alike. All such EV-related offerings and programs must be part of a larger framework that creates benefits for all customers by utilizing tools such as load management offerings and rate structures that ensure benefits to the system outweigh costs. These are just a few examples of the ways in which South Carolina can address the existing and future challenges to electrification of the transportation sector identified in my testimony and the company's comments. In my responsive testimony, I briefly discussed the role that demand charges can play in those electrification efforts. Demand charges are often an effective tool in helping to align prices with cost causation, develop simple, understandable rate structures, avoid undue discrimination, and provide price signals that are actionable. Demand charges can also drive off-peak charging behavior, which may mitigate the need for utilities to build new capacity assets to satisfy EV demand. In that scenario, demand charges could essentially help utilities avoid rate increases and create the potential for downward rate pressure as South Carolina electrifies its transportation sector. This concludes the summary of my direct and responsive testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Chair Belzer, at this time, Mr. Oliver is available for cross-examination from other parties and questioning by the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Parties, any questions for this witness? Seeing none. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Oliver? Commissioner Caston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Mr. Oliver. Looking at your direct testimony on page 4 and 5, where you talk about the companies already designing tools and programs independent of this docket, and you talk about what you just mentioned must be part of a larger framework that creates benefits for all customers utilizing tools such as load management offerings, rate structures, and ensure benefits to the system outweigh cost. And, you know, I think I know what that means, but does that mean such as no cost shift or growth pays for growth, such as that?
Yeah, so the tools that I'm contemplating on those pages, let's start with grid readiness in general. The first thing we need to know is where the large spot loads are coming. Large spot loads would be things like what we talked about a lot yesterday, DC fast current or DCFC, direct current fast current, direct current fast charging, public charging stations. We need to determine where those are going to be in advance so we can plan for that. We also need to know where large fleet operators, think last mile delivery companies that send trucks through the neighborhoods delivering items. We have many of those, many different types of those. We're taking a look at where all those are, anticipating what those needs are going to be as they electrify. Now bear in mind, many of these locations, they're right next to each other. They locate where the highways make sense for them, where logistics makes sense for them. So it's not unusual to have one big delivery company with 300 trucks and right next to it is another big delivery company with 200 trucks. We have to think about that in advance, identify those locations, and think about the capacity projects that are going to be required to serve that load in advance. So we've created tools to do that, in-house tools, using things like Google Maps and different load forecasting techniques that give us an idea where these loads are going to be so we can plan ahead for those particular loads. It could take years sometimes to get the material required to serve those particular areas. So that's one of the examples that I talk about when I say tools. I'll give you two more, Commissioner Caston, that I hope makes sense. And I may repeat a lot of what we discussed yesterday, but I think a lot of what we discussed yesterday was very good. And we need to create a menu of managed charging options for each different rate class and each different type of customer, so that every customer has the opportunity to participate in a managed charging option. So for example, we do have a pilot program in DEC, South Carolina now, that essentially we give customers a monthly incentive if they just charge off-peak. It's a residential program only. If they charge off-peak, they get an incentive. We have that program in many other states, well, multiple other states also, and it proves very effective there, and it has been effective here. We also we have it in DEP now. We have newly designed time of use rates that are straightforward to understand, that a customer can also choose if they're available for residential and commercial, but they make sense for residential customers, particularly those with an electric vehicle. So you have a simple offering, something like the off-peak credit, where all I have to do is not charge during peak, and I would get a certain amount of monthly credit on my bill. There's a carrot, no stick. Then I would have time of use, where I can be a little bit more proactive, maybe try and charge during what we call a discount period, where it would be very inexpensive, but make sure I don't charge during the peak periods. Also, one of the tools we don't have today for residential customers would be an active demand response program. Duke Energy knows a lot about demand response. We have, across all of the jurisdictions, we have over 1 million customers that participate in demand response programs. Eventually, we envision it will be cost effective to have demand response programs for electric vehicles also. Right now, it's difficult to do that because we peak in the morning in the winter. Frankly, not a lot of electric vehicles are charging then. So, but that likely will change and load patterns are shift, so we need to be ready for when that happens. On the commercial side, same thing. We need to create a menu of options. It begins with time of use. And then we also have a program for commercial customers in DEP, which we intend to bring to DEC, called hourly pricing. Hourly pricing, if customers have load flexibility, hourly pricing enables these customers to do better than if they were on a traditional demand charge rate. It still makes sure they pay their fair share, but for those that can move their load around, it's beneficial for them.
Since you mentioned the hourly pricing, yeah, I actually had to go back and look at that and try to figure it out again. And I'm not sure I figured it out again. But I think it sounds like you're looking at the I guess hourly, I think it was more hourly usage over 365 days, and I was trying to understand how, kind of dive a little deeper on that, explain how that works and how that would benefit one of these fast charging stations.
Certainly, and we do have fast charging customers that have begun to take advantage of the hourly pricing rate, which is exciting to see. So to your point, Commissioner Caston, we'll look at 8760 hours and create what we call a customer baseline or a CBL. And at a high level, based on that baseline, if you can reduce your usage compared to your baseline during times of high marginal price, you can save money. So it incentivizes customers to lower usage during those time frames. Conversely, if there are times of low marginal price, let's say like yesterday afternoon, sun was shining, nuclear plants humming like they always do, a very good time to use energy. You could use a bit more than your baseline, and it would be very inexpensive to do so. So it incentivizes customers who have flexibility to perhaps move that load around a little bit to take advantage of those pricing signals. Now, those prices come a day ahead, so it's possible, and one of our witnesses yesterday discussed the ability to change prices throughout the day. So it's possible to take a look at what these prices are going to be on an hourly level and move pricing around if you happen to be a DC fast charge provider. You could potentially move prices around and, yes, incentivize customers to come charge when it was more appropriate to do so for the grid. We're excited about the program, still in the early stages, but think it has good potential.
Okay. That's kind of the way I understood it. And
I'm not a rate expert, Commissioner. I'm more of a T&D engineer, but I've learned a lot over the years.
well, thinking about that T&D engineering,
Mhm.
you know, I know it's not the same, but I've often said I kind of look at that as distribution in the air.
Mhm.
And you'd mentioned thinking about these things in planning. Typically, you do see these big, large trucks or whatever near major roads, intersections, I-26, I-85, you know, where they can get on and get off. You know, that had that in our area. And typically, that is where we would have larger infrastructure for the system. And I don't know if it's the proper assumption, but I assume that the electric utilities have perhaps larger infrastructure or more competent infrastructure in those kind of areas. Is that accurate, generally speaking?
I would say it depends. That is certainly possible, but we can't rely on that. Many of these locations are in more urban areas where our system is largely built out, and sometimes it is really challenging to add capacity in an area where all the roads are done being widened, where there's no more empty lots. It just becomes much harder to do so. So it's not always the case. It certainly can be the case, but not something we can rely on. So that's why we're trying to take, for those types of loads, a proactive approach of looking, understanding, talking to all the customers that we can, getting plans ahead of time as much as we can, so we can lay out these capacity projects well in advance.
Okay, that makes sense, and I agree. Best to upgrade those lines before they put in 6 lanes. With that in mind, as part of the planning process, you know, for example, you know, we have infrastructure in a certain area that's adequate, you know, fire flow, everything. And there's areas, say that were old peach farms, that the property's probably less expensive because the infrastructure isn't there. So there's a desire, rush for developers or whatever to develop that. But as that occurs, you need more infrastructure, you need more water, bigger roads, more electricity. In Duke's planning, how do you account for that? In other words, when I say growth pays for growth, if that is the case, if, okay, you need this big facility in the middle of nowhere where there's no infrastructure, do they pay for that typically, that cost to improve the infrastructure to provide that service, or how does that work?
If it's, so here's the general way I would answer that. If it's one customer that is causing the upgrade, then typically that customer would follow our line extension policy guidelines. And the line extension, you know, then it relates to how much revenue we expect to see over a 3-year period compared to the cost. If the revenue over a 3-year period is greater than the cost to upgrade the lines, then there typically would not be a charge to the customer if it's a standard service. They don't ask for anything special. Now, where it gets more interesting, and I give you maybe a real-world example, when I had that job many years ago, but I had a cubicle, and on the walls of my cubicle, I had a huge map with all of our different circuits in the area I had with that map. And when I learned about a potential project, say 300 home subdivision, or a new strip mall, or a Walmart, and Walmart's here, so or those. I learned something yesterday about how many customers live right near a Walmart. I would take that and I would write it on the board where we anticipated it to be and the expected in-service date. Now, what you'll end up with is 4, 5, 6 multiple different load growth opportunities in one area. And then I would create a capacity project. Capacity project meaning, is the substation big enough to serve that load? Is the main wires going down the road, our backbone distribution circuit, is that going to be big enough in time to serve all these loads? So in that case, we'd call that a capacity project, and typically would not charge customers for that piece. They would be charged for the line extension, if appropriate, to their particular property once we had the capacity available. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but that's typically how it works.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Contribution aid to construction, or however you approach it, that seems to be fairly common, and that's
Right.
makes sense. Finally, I noticed, I think, on your responsive comments relative to the question of charge points, Mr. Deal recommending the commission establish alternatives to traditional demand charges. Let me get to the bottom line of the question. Do you agree that new EV load has the potential to apply downward rate pressure? You say yes, but, always a but.
Yeah.
And I understand that. It is important to recognize that this potential may be realized only with appropriate rate making. And you go on and you mention it in your summary, especially when managed, or that load is managed, that can fit with time periods. And I was thinking back to, I think, Dominion's witness, Mr. Cassis, said something very similar. So what I understood in your direct testimony and your response is all those things are possible, but the demand still has to pay for the demand. The user or the causation is the key to that. Is that correct?
I think that's correct, but I would also put it this way. Our system is not a two-dimensional system, it's a three-dimensional system. And that third dimension is time. And time, when the load actually occurs, is really critical. So if we can support much of this load growth without spending a significant amount on infrastructure, if the load growth occurs during times of the day when we have available capacity. That is really the key. If we can accomplish that, and some of the tools that I talked about earlier and others have talked about throughout this particular hearing, help us do that. Time of use rates, off-peak credit type rates, hourly pricing. If we can mold that load into the areas where we have valleys in our load shape, that gives us the opportunity to serve the load while creating potential downward rate pressure. But it likely won't happen if we're not successful there.
I think you say pretty much that further down, where you say the challenge to electrification of the transportation sector is general grid capacity. And you said there is the potential for increased cost with new EV loads, particularly if new EV loads occur during peak times, which I think makes the point you just made, correct?
Yes, Commissioner, yes.
Well, thank you. It's been educational and informative for me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Commissioners, questions for this witness?
Madam Chair,
Vice Chair Powers.
thank you. And thank you, Mr. Oliver, for being here. I was looking in your testimony, and you made what I thought was an interesting point about if the charging, EV charging is left up totally to the free market, open market, that we could end up with the same situation that we had with broadband, as far as there being what we called, I think, a digital divide back then. And I've done some work on broadband and served on a couple of panels. And you said because of that, then Duke needs to be involved. Do you mean that Duke is going to get into the business of charging stations? And if so, how will that benefit rural and low-income areas, which many are served by co-ops and not in your actual service area?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner. In South Carolina, Duke actually does own and operate rate-based DC fast charge stations today. We have 30 locations, 2 chargers each. Now, not all of these are installed. We're about 2/3 of the way. This began in 2021. By the way, we do this in many states. We have nearly 1,000 chargers that we operate in the rate base today. We did that largely to, one, to gain experience, to understand what charging patterns look like, and also to maybe help to kickstart that market. We have no plans to go any further there in South Carolina or anywhere at this time with rate-based public charging, unless we are asked to do so. And I think multiple of my colleagues that served as witnesses recognize that there's a potential. There could be some areas where it is difficult for third parties to come in and do viable charging for the public. And if it is decided that that Duke can fill that gap, we'll do our best to do so. But we're not going to be asking to do any more. We've gotten the information we need largely from these programs. Not all the way in South Carolina yet, but I don't think that South Carolina is going to look vastly different from the other states that we serve when it comes to the load of the DC fast chargers. So if asked, we'll certainly help in that regard. We know how to do it. We can do it. But I think generally we're in agreement that let's see if the market can solve that issue. We also have the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Act, NEVI. I believe South Carolina has $70 million of grant money that the DOT in South Carolina is looking at to determine where to put public charging at critical location. That's going to help also. I think it's important that the utilities are involved with that, not from a charging station perspective, but we need to help select the sites that are going to be more straightforward to serve, give as much information as we can to the folks that are looking to bid to do that work, and maybe simplify the process by giving some straightforward information about here's some good places to look, here's some places where it might be difficult to look. I will say that in the experience I have, much more important to siting of public charging are things like the amenities around the public charging locations. Is it in the right spot where people that are traveling need to go to? Because largely, as was mentioned yesterday, the vast majority of charging takes place where the vehicle dwells, whether that is residential or small business and commercial. Just like those last mile delivery trucks that come into your neighborhood from multiple different companies, they charge where they park. It's rare for them to use, not unheard of, but rare for them to use a public charging. So they have to be in spots where they can help folks make long trips. And I think that's what the NEVI program is really all about. And we stand ready to help in any way we can there.
How can that be done without being a burden to all ratepayers, not just electric vehicle users?
Well, when it comes to serving the load from DC fast chargers, we serve that load and apply the same rules that we do for any other commercial industrial load. So if it requires a contribution native construction, that would be appropriate. If line extension policy applies, that would also be appropriate. So if we can find a spot where significant line extension policies would not apply, that would help get that station in for less money, which means there'd be more money to go around for more charging stations. We serve that load just like we do with any other load, so the same rules would apply. There should be no effect on the rate base.
I think you said there's about 1,000 charging stations that throughout your entire Duke territory. Are there programs or initiatives in other states that we don't have here yet that we may be getting or may not be getting?
Well, let me clarify the comment. I said that Duke Energy owns and operates approximately 1,000 different public charging opportunities, right? A lot of those are level 2, say in parking lots, but many of those are also level 3, the DCFC. So those are Duke Energy's charging stations that we started years ago to gain experience in this, and we've gained that experience and feel that we've got a lot of lessons learned, and unless asked, are unlikely to do any more of that rate-based public charging. We have many more than 1,000 public charging stations across our territories, many more. That's just the ones that we own. To the second question, are there locations that have other programs different than South Carolina? There are. We have just a few examples. We do have the off-peak credit as a more robust program than we do today in South Carolina in several different states. Every state where we have that, including South Carolina, the behavior change exhibited by the customers is very good. It's really straightforward to program your vehicle to charge during certain times of the day. It's really all you have to do to begin to take advantage of this credit. But some states it's beyond just the small amount of customers that we have here. Now we'll be looking to make a program similar to that permanent relatively soon here in South Carolina once we're ready and through some of these other things. So that's one example. We have in one of our states a fleet advisory program where our experts on the fleet team, we have a team that is dedicated to fleet electrification. I mean customer fleets, large fleets, where we'll go and provide a small amount of engineering services to help customers make the right decisions about how much charging they need, when the appropriate times to charge are, those type of things. In another state, we have approved a make-ready credit program that is extremely successful so far, where we help customers with the infrastructure that they need to prepare for 240-volt charging. Now, largely these programs apply to residential and small business. There's not a huge amount of applications to DCFC, although it can be. Certainly it doesn't exclude those customers, but the vast majority of participants are residential in nature that are not looking at a DCFC charger, but a 240-volt charger, and this program helps them get the infrastructure in place. So we also have a program that we call EVSC tariff approved in another state, which gives customers an option to lease a charger. It's actually a tariffed offering, but it gives customers an opportunity. It looks a lot like a lease, to lease a charger for a monthly fee. This is for private use, not for public use. The customers actually operate that. They didn't buy it. They leased it from us. And for some customers, that gives them a much better feel about moving forward with a program like this because it's new. They may not be experts in what charging is, and it helps them feel a little more comfortable about being able to move forward. So there's multiple programs in other jurisdictions. We take all of those lessons learned and apply them to states like South Carolina.
Thank you for that. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioners, further questions for the witness?
Chair Belzer?
Commissioner Carol Lee Williams?
Thank you, Chair Belzer. Good to see you, Mr. Oliver.
Hello.
I will start. I thank you for all the answers you've given my colleagues. I'd like to start by talking about demand charges and the idea that over time, understanding that we're at a low adoption rate now, and what I've generally heard are very different opinions about demand charges, but that as we increase adoption, there is more option for more concern about subsidization over time. But we're at a nascent period here. So would you speak to demand charges from the idea of where we are now to where we may be in a few years to farther along the path?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And my colleague yesterday from representing the co-ops, I thought did an excellent job talking about demand charges, particularly at the distribution level. So when we're talking about at the distribution level, we're building what it needs to serve the peak demand of that customer, regardless of when it occurs. It may be a 500 kVA transformer that serves a DCFC location. It's usually more like 1,000 or a 1,500. And regardless of when that occurs, that infrastructure has to be there in order to serve that at the local level. So those types of demand charges are there to cover really fixed cost assets at that distribution level. It's very difficult to not have those even for a short amount of time because we really did have to build the infrastructure. Now, as you move up the chain, say the interconnected networked transmission grid and the bulk power system where the generation facilities are, there's something known as diversity that occurs. And diversity means many different customers are using electricity throughout the day, and the demand, the facilities we built to serve just that one DCFC, from a distribution perspective, that timing may not coincide with the system peak. So I think there's an opportunity to consider some options around demand charges, but we'd have to look at local and then maybe how it contributes to the system peak. Frankly, I think time of use rates can be just as effective, and something like hourly pricing that we've just had approved in DEP South Carolina. I would propose we give those a chance before we look into something like was described yesterday that could cause problems with cost causation and cross-subsidization.
Thinking about this at a bigger picture level, some of my involvement in the National Regulatory NARUC group has given me some exposure to a state that has a goal, and it's Michigan, a goal of not increasing their peak due to electrification. And think about this. This is Michigan and Detroit, and but I'm thinking about the conversation you just had. I think it was with Vice Chair Powers about the ability to manage the peak. Do you think that any kind of goal like that for South Carolina would be helpful, reasonable, crazy?
I don't know that I would call it a goal, but I would call it a something to strive for. If you think about when we peak in the Carolinas, we peak in the cold, dark winter mornings, typically. That is the system peak. We certainly have summer peaks as well, but the system peak right now is based on those cold, dark winter mornings. So if we can control vehicle charging to limit the amount that happens during those cold, dark winter mornings, I think what you're speculating about, Commissioner, is certainly a possibility, but not every customer has that amount of flexibility. Certain customers won't have that flexibility. For those types of customers, this is where maybe something like active demand response can come into play, where instead of being time of use or always being able to avoid that particular 3-hour window in the winter, when we really are close to system peak, we would be able to offer programs to those customers where we could actually control that. That happens much less often. So we've not talked about a goal like that, but certainly from a vision perspective, something to strive for.
And the active control that you just talked about, is that something that can happen through the vehicle's telematics, or is it something that happens with the charger itself? Did I understand you correct when you talked about actively controlling demand?
You did, and both of those methods are possible. The real trick here, I recently was in Washington, D.C., meeting with the DOE about this very topic. And the real trick here is many of the vehicle manufacturers have different protocols for how this communication would take place. So we're trying to work with with a consortium of those vehicle manufacturers to come up with a more common platform that all utilities would be able to communicate with. It is much simpler in the newer vehicles. This is very possible, much simpler for the vehicles to actually control the charging than for us to put in a switch or a relay like we do with an air conditioner or a heat pump or a heat strip. That's what we'll do today. It's less expensive, and very likely the way that we want to strive for is to have the vehicles themselves do it. You could also do it with chargers that are networked, as long as we can get a signal out either to the particular OEM or the operator of that charger, again, in a way that makes sense to do so. That's another option, and the reality, I believe, is we'll have to explore all of those options and maybe even employ all of them.
I was at a meeting where there was some talk about one major provider, Tesla, working on arrangements. This is a different scenario. This has to do with the recharging, help me, the plug being compatible with multiple chargers. Yes. Might that help with that? That's a different technology, but might that help with the ability for utilities to communicate with these vehicles or with the chargers? Or does that complicate things?
No, it does not complicate things. It simplifies things for EV drivers to have more simple options when it comes to plug types, without a doubt. Mm-hmm. So I personally think it's a great move for, you mentioned Tesla, so we'll talk about that. A great move for Tesla to begin to open their stations to other manufacturers. By far, they have the most DC fast charging in the country in some pretty good locations. So I think that's going to benefit a lot of folks going forward. And the opportunity to have adapter plugs and a more common plug as we go forward, I think is going to help the industry in general. But it wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact on how we control charging on the vehicles. Okay. It just makes it easier to plug in.
Thank you for understanding my question and filling in the blanks for me. Yeah, I think you got the question and the answer. I'm going to shift to the transportation electrification planning. And I think you had some comments on that, and I guess I'd like to hear it on the record, kind of that the relationship of that to IRPs that we already review, and I guess how we can make the IRPs as robust as possible, and whether we need something that's separate from the IRP process.
Sure. So, the IRPs, we are looking at all load projections throughout our system. So it's not just electrification, it's everything. And the reality is, if you take a look at, what's happening in the Carolinas in particular, there's more load growth right now from other sources than there is from transportation electrification. There's a lot of load growth occurring in the Carolinas. It's an attractive place to be. We all know that, and many others are finding that out. So we have to look at all of that, not just transportation electrification. So if you think about a simple level, our integrated resource plans are taking a look at, let's say, 10 years out, what we expect the load to be and what it's going to take to serve that load. Now, typically, we don't get locational in an integrated resource plan. So in other words, envision the entire networked transmission system and our system of generation facilities serving the entire expected load in a particular territory. We're not getting into what's going to serve the new grocery store on feeder X164. So we don't get down to that level typically in the IRP. Now, the challenge with vehicle electrification really is it's much more local. This is where a lot of the challenges occur. Large spot loads, like a 1500 kVA load from a new DCFC location, or large spot loads from multiple fleet customers that have given plans to electrify, whether it is global plans to electrify or very specific plans. Those spot loads occur on a specific street, and we have to take a look at the specific circuits and infrastructure that serves those spot loads. Those are much more difficult to deal with in an IRP because they're very local in nature. So what the team that reports to me that focuses on transportation electrification does is focus a lot more on these local issues. Where are the local issues going to be? What do we need to do to get ahead of those issues? Make sure we have contemplated what it's going to take. Have we proactively reached out to those customers, understand their plans, understand the types of vehicles they're going to use? All of that is where it's at, I'm going to say, when it comes to preparing the grid for electrification right now. It's not, at least in our system, if you look at what's in our IRPs and the growth that we've anticipated from electric vehicles, a lot of great work is done there. We have professional load forecasters that do this, and we use very specific tools, and I feel very good about what they've put together and confident we'll be able to meet that load. I'm a lot more focused right now on the local issues, and that's where I think if we did have a triennial transportation electrification plan, I would take a look at local issues. What are you doing on the T&D system to serve these big spot loads? What are you doing to assure that our distribution transformers locally, if one residential transformer has 5 240-volt chargers on it, what are you doing to make sure that that transformer is not going to be overloaded at that local level? Managed charging is one of the answers there. Multiple different opportunities that start at different times, so there's charging windows. Again, so we can move the load to places where we know we have the capability to do it. So that's where my focus is in helping to prepare the areas that Duke Energy serves across the Southeast and the Midwest, including South Carolina. And we're going to make sure we do that to the best of our ability. If there is the requirement for a triennial transportation plan that addresses that, then we'd be glad to do whatever the commission asks that we do. But that's our job, is to do just what I described, to make sure we're doing that, thinking ahead of that. So, yeah.
Well, and tell me how this sounds, but when I married the conversation about the, not the goal, but what did you call it? An aspiration,
A
in
vision.
terms of a what?
A vision.
A vision.
Yeah.
If you have that vision of not exceeding your peak due to transportation electrification, the way to solve it is exactly what you described at the local level. Have I put these two things together appropriately or not?
Yeah, I think generally, that's not always the case, but generally loads at the local level are very close to loads at the system level, not always. But, you know, generally if you have appropriate managed charging options, appropriate rates, appropriate different options that can appeal to the vast majority of customers, then certainly we can help shift the load in the right direction. So they're related for sure.
Okay. That sounded like a polite way of saying kind of, but not really. My two quick last, well, kind of quick last questions are, I want to turn to hosting capacity maps and get your input on them. How realistic are they? How helpful are they?
Mm-hmm.
You know, are there concerns about keeping them up to date? Are they worth it? You know, there was a time when you were talking earlier today that I was thinking, well, I think what we've heard so far are that individual team members are responding. But let me let you respond. Are hosting capacity maps that would allow somebody who is looking to install a DCFC on the private side, would they be helpful?
I think, and I would maybe answer in a little different way. I would not call it a hosting capacity map. I would call it a load capacity map. Hosting capacity is a term that we use largely associated with the ability to accept generation onto our system. Something like a new solar farm or you know, some type of microgrid. And hosting capacity is different from load capacity. Hosting capacity, we have to look at multiple protection and control scenarios to assure that we have something known as, say, anti-islanding built in, which makes sure that the system remains safe, right, in certain types of events because there's another generation source coming on that system. So there's a lot of things go into hosting capacity that don't go into load capacity. And what we're largely talking about here is load capacity. And I would be very cautious about the value of load capacity maps because no matter what you see on that map, you have to verify it. And I'll take it a little bit of different level. Certainly if you see that, hey, there's capacity available in this specific location, and usually it's just going to be at the entire circuit level. If you look at a lot of the load capacity maps out there today, they're not very granular. They just look at the entire circuit. It doesn't necessarily get down to a street corner where I'm considering putting DCFC. But let's just say you looked at that map and it said there was no capacity available on that, in that location. While that may be true today, there may be plans in place to build another circuit and connect through connectivity and create capacity available at that location. I would much rather encourage our customers to make the phone call, get in touch with the local engineer who is the expert about what's going to happen in those areas. If you envision, you know, we're a geography-based company, and our engineers will have an area that they're accountable for. And they know that area extremely well and know what the capacity plans are and what the gaps are and what is going to be happening in the future. Much better for those customers to get in touch with those knowledgeable individuals to get the best information possible. And as far as, you know, how, say, larger DCFC companies would get in touch with us and make that happen. Many of those larger companies have what we call a large account manager. Their first stop would be the large account manager. Large account manager would say, all right, understand, we have a program team that's focused on DCFC. I'll get you to them. And that team happens to roll up into my organization in the transportation electrification team. And those folks would make sure that the expert engineers in the field became involved. So there wouldn't be a search or trying to figure out, who to actually talk to. Now that can happen if you don't have an assigned account manager. You can go to the website, but typically you would call our general news service number or get to the general news service line, and our call center associates would put in an order. It would go to one of our engineers specifically in that area, and they would make the phone call back to that particular customer. And, some of the folks today or yesterday, say sometimes we have a hard time, hearing back from our utility partners in a timely fashion. And if that happens for our company, let us know about it. We'll address it.
Okay. And my last series of questions, or my last question really is, in your testimony, you talked some about, because we prompted the answer, what about EV charging stations along evacuation routes? And my question there really is, I know we asked the question, but what role does the commission and the commission with utilities have in that regard?
Well, I think the utilities have a really important role in that regard. And the first one to me is education. And, I grew up on the East Coast of Florida, and a lot of hurricanes there, just like we do here. And our parents basically had a list of things you do, right? Go to the bank and get money, make sure you have water, make sure the gas tank is full days before the storm happens, right? This was routine back then. And those same educational priorities apply to electric vehicle owners. Don't wait until the storm is near to make sure the vehicle is totally charged. Charge that vehicle well up front. We can help educate customers on the importance of that. Make sure they understand how critical it is, because you may be out of power for an extended period of time, whether you charge at home or charge at a DCFC or charge at your place of business. So that'd be the first thing I would say. The next thing is we have to provide the power, at least to the areas that we serve, to the public charging stations that are going to help customers along the way. So we certainly need to be involved in it. And as mentioned by my colleague from Dominion, maybe take a look at hardening our service to those particular locations to help make sure that it would stay up. Now, I think the most important time is before the storm, when people are evacuating. Regardless, though, hardening the service to those particular locations that are deemed critical seems to be a really good idea, something we ought to look at. So as far as where those locations are, what the right, we're not experts in that, really. That sounds like something that, the state DOT might have more expertise in. But we stand ready to do our part and help.
And I also wonder about generators or solar capability. I think I've even read about portable ways of ensuring that the electric charging facilities are able to operate in the event of a power outage. Any comments there?
Yeah, I have a few. I think when you're thinking about hurricane restoration, we need to think longer term. 2 to 5 days could be longer. When you get to that duration of outage, it becomes difficult for something like a battery, even a battery backed up by solar, because I can't guarantee what the weather is going to be like after the storm. A lot of times it's sunny after a storm. A lot of times it's not, right? So we need to be a little bit careful about saying we can do this with for something that may have to run for 3 to 5 days. You're probably looking at something like a generator, and the generators would have to be sized appropriately to serve that load. Say 1.5 megawatts, you're going to need a generator a little bit larger than that. Those types of generators certainly exist today. And we'd want to make sure that the chargers in those locations have a feature known as throttling, which means that we can actually lower the amperage. And most newer chargers do. We can lower the amperage to a certain level to make sure we're not going to exceed what's available from a generator. But all of those things are certainly possible for those locations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliver. I appreciate the education and the information.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. So I think I just have one question, and so there was some talk there about the relationship to the integrated resource plan, and this week on Monday we had the avoided cost proceeding in connection with the Duke companies, and I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but it seems to me that that could have a relationship to time of use rates for charging vehicles. Are you familiar with avoided cost and what that relates to? And
I am familiar with our integrated resource plan, and probably the best. First of all, I understand, and I think there's some merit, Commissioner Thomas, to what you're describing. So, for example, today, when we take a look at what's in our integrated resource plans, the demand response capability is accounted for usually in those integrated resource plans. In other words, should we need to use demand response, this would be the projected capability, right? And eventually, as we get more electric vehicles in the territory and understand much better how they respond to time of use rates, how they respond to things like off-peak. So far, it's been looking good, but there's not enough out there just yet to be able to definitively say in something like an IRP, here's what the benefit is going to be. We're going to keep looking at that, and as we learn more, it's very possible we'll be able to add something like that, that capability in.
okay, well, I guess basically what I was kind of thinking is that in the avoided cost proceeding, the company pays these qualifying facilities higher rates during times when it brings more value to the company, such as the early morning winter peak times. And it just seems to me like, well, that same sort of a concept would apply to the rates charged if you do time of use rates with regards to EVs. Then it might be worth looking at the two together. That's where I'm coming from on that. And if you have any thoughts, that's good. If
Well, I do. I think they're related, maybe inversely though, because the way we would do it for something like time of use is we actually charge more during those periods. Customers would pay more for demand and more for energy used during those periods. So we're paying more to get the power, and our customers that are using during those particular peak periods would appropriately pay more to use that power. So I think they are related.
right, okay, that was what I was getting at. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Commissioner Caston?
Thank you. I just really had a follow-up question, I guess, with your question with Commissioner Carolee Williams. And, thinking about identifying the regulatory challenges and opportunities and what I've been hearing over the last 2 days. I know I think it's probably the next witness, talk about transportation electrification plans. We've talked about RFPs, and Commissioner Williams addressed those. But what I think I'm hearing, at least from the utilities, including the co-ops, is that planning is essential. You're doing the planning, and relative to whether it's capacity maps or what, it sounds good on paper, but the reality is, if I'm hearing you, is that the planning involves looking at what the loads, future loads are going to be, whether it's EV or whatever it is, loads load. And relative to the maps, that could change in a day. So I guess what I'm asking is, I'd like to be part of the opportunities, not part of the challenges. Don't want to add any more than's necessary. So having heard all that and rambling as I'm rambling, am I summing up what I think I'm hearing from you, and you can't speak for the other utilities, that the planning process that occurs, including the RP, considers these loads and load forecasts? And that's kind of the summation of it. Have I oversimplified that too much? Relative to just EV charging or having a transportation electrification plan.
The planning that we do today for load growth in the IRP certainly takes into account the projected growth from vehicle electrification. We update our forecast twice a year. We do one in the fall, one in the spring. And it doesn't change dramatically, but there are certain things that can affect it. So, we're always looking ahead, trying to understand what the load is going to be in each of the areas that we serve. And again, you're right, Commissioner, it's more than just EVs. It's every other load growth type of every other load growth project, right, that occurs in our territory. All of that is projected and built into it. Where it gets a little complicated, again, is at that local level, where the wire size is what the wire size is down there. And, we can only serve a certain amount of load based on what we have, in the field today. And so trying to get ahead of that is important. And, sort of the problems we run into here, if you think about what it takes to build, let's say, a new mall. Don't build a lot of new malls anymore since COVID, but when a new mall was going in, it might be 5 to 8 megawatts worth of load, for example, maybe a little bit more. We'd have 3 years, 4 years maybe to plan for that. Construction plans, right, has to go through zoning and permitting. That's the type of thing I draw up on that map I talked about earlier, right, and put it in our forecast so we can anticipate if we may need, a bank upgrade or something like that. Challenge with electric vehicle growth at the spot level is that same amount of load can occur just from growth at an existing location. There's not a lot of permits required. They already have the land. The load literally rolls in on wheels. So it can happen much faster. This is why we do as much recon as we can, try and get ahead of the game as far as we can in working with these customers to understand what's happening and, do we need to add general capacity to serve these spot loads or not. That is particularly challenging, and we're all working through that and learning.
When let me ask you just a point blank, the suggestion that the commission require transportation electrification plans. Do you see a need for that? If so, why? If not, why?
Personally, I I don't see a need for it because, Commissioner, I'm going to do it anyway. It's part of our job to be able to serve new load that comes into the system. It's part of our job to create programs that are going to manage the load in an appropriate way, like we talked about with managed charging. So we're going to do that. We're going to make sure we do that. It's part of our mission to appropriately serve customers in the best possible way. If we decide that it makes sense for the state to have a plan like that, that's fine, because again, we're going to be doing it anyway. It's part of our job to do so. So I don't think it's necessary, but I'm also not necessarily concerned about us having to do a huge amount of work if we require one. We're going to do it.
Final question. Is that a rambling wreck from Georgia Tech, Ty, or is that just random selection?
Yes.
Bragging about Miami. All right, thank you, sir.
I'm glad you mentioned that victory at Miami. Yes.
Commissioners, any further questions for this witness?
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Urban?
thank you. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm well. I hope you are.
Yes, sir. Wanted to follow up again with the question about the evacuation routes. I realize, of course, that Duke Energy Carolinas is not so much concerned about that relative to Duke Energy Progress and Dominion and Santee Cooper, but just generally thinking about having EV charging stations on evacuation routes in the planning stage, since we have to assume that people are evacuating due to a weather emergency, shouldn't we also assume that there may be power outages, and therefore we should co-locate a solar capability with those EV charging stations so that they are available when evacuations are mandated? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, Commissioner, and I agree that there's going to be power outages in that type of event, and we should prepare for that. I would be a little bit cautious about solar being the backup source. And the reason I'd be a little cautious is because we should expect for power to be out for an extended period of time. We could be out for days versus hours. And when we come to something like that, it becomes a bit more challenging for solar to be able to handle that load for multiple days. You'd have to put in a large amount of solar to deal with the large amount of load that happens at these DCFC stations. And so, while certainly possible, something to look at, probably in that particular case, a better scenario to assure that that power is available will be something like a backup generator.
What about battery storage? Is that another option that might help?
It absolutely is. Battery storage is another option and something that I'm passionate about, of course. But I think, again, for this particular use case, we'd want to look at what the most cost-effective solution was for that location. And if we're talking about being able to power, say, a 1.5 megawatt load for 3 to 5 days, it's going to be expensive to do that with a battery. If you're talking about that particular duration, it can be done, but it would be expensive. So I would want to take a look at different alternatives, including potentially battery storage paired with solar, but also let's look at something like a backup generator also. Now, these would not be used very often, right? So that's the other thing, is they truly are there for emergency purposes. So there's not a significant amount of usage there, which is something else we need to take into consideration.
The other concern that I have is my understanding that the federal legislation prohibits locating EV charging stations in rest stops along the interstate. Is that correct?
I would have to look that up. I don't know the answer to that question.
I think that's the case. but in the event of a weather event that requires evacuations, you think that perhaps the investor-owned utilities could get a waiver for those units to operate in an emergency situation at a rest stop? Because the great majority of traffic coming out of the Low Country would probably be on Interstate 26 and perhaps other heavily traveled highways, depending on where the storm's located. But it just seems to me that that we ought to see if we can get a waiver for emergency use only. Just a suggestion.
I understand this suggestion. I'm not familiar with that particular prohibition, but I would say, first of all, the Duke Energy anyway would not be the owner or operator of those public charging stations. We would, in our territory, provide service to those public charging stations. So we likely would not be the entity that would pursue a waiver. The other thing that is certainly possible is not use the NEVI funds for those locations.
Right.
Right. Just if it makes sense, put it in.
Yeah. Excuse me. Didn't mean to speak over you. The Department of Highways and Public Transportation in South Carolina might be the appropriate agency to seek a waiver for emergency use only. But maybe that's a better question for them in terms of future planning. Thank you you've been most informative today, and appreciate your being with us. Thank you.
You're welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, any further questions for this witness? Mr. Cooper, any redirect? Thank you. Mr. Oliver, thank you very much for your appearance and your testimony today. You may stand down.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, that completes. Okay. Next on our list is South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and Vote Solar. I tell you what, we've been going about an hour and 20 minutes. Why don't we take a short break, and we'll come back with, I think Mr. Cross is our next witness. Let's come back at 3:30. That's about a 13-minute break. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Public Service Commission following a brief recess. We are continuing in the proceeding in docket 2023-121E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. Attending virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin and Commissioner Carolee Williams. Before the break, I think we announced we are on South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and Vote Solar. I believe our witness is virtual, Mr. Cross.
Yes, that is correct.
And
This
Ms.
is Emma Clancy on behalf of CCL Stace and Vote Solar, and we'd like to call Stan Cross to this stand.
Good afternoon, Ms. Clancy. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Cross.
Good afternoon.
Would you state your name for me for the record?
My name is Stan Cross.
Mr. Cross, I'm going to ask you to raise your right hand and let me administer the oath to swear you in. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. Clancy?
Thank you, Chair Bowser. Mr. Cross, would you please state your name, title, and employer for the commission, please?
My name is Stan Cross, and I am the Electric Transportation Policy Director at Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
And Mr. Cross, did you cause to be pre-filed in this docket on September 19th, direct testimony consisting of 6 pages?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or changes to your direct testimony at this time?
No.
Mr. Cross, if the questions put to you in your pre-filed testimony were asked at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
And did you also attach to your direct testimony 3 exhibits identified as exhibits SC1, SC2, and SC3?
Yes.
Were the exhibits to your testimony prepared by you or under your direction?
Yes.
Chair Belzer, I would now move to have Mr. Cross's pre-filed direct testimony and exhibits entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Cross will be admitted into the record as if given from the stand. The exhibits accompanying his pre-filed direct testimony that are marked SC1 through SC3 will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as hearing exhibit 9 and admitted into the evidence of this case.
Thank you. Mr. Cross, please describe your education and training and provide the commission with a summary of what your current job entails.
Happily. In my current role as Electric Transportation Policy Director at Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I lead electric transportation policy and utility reform efforts across the Southeast. Previously, I led and co-founded Brightfield Transportation Solutions, a startup infrastructure company that designs and deploys solar integrated electric vehicle charging stations. My combined experience amounts to 15 years of work in the electric transportation trenches, during which I've worked extensively to develop innovative and supportive state, municipal, and utility policies to unlock the electric transportation market. My leadership has been recognized by the U.S. Department of Energy, Clean Cities Partner Award, and the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association Clean Energy Business Community Initiative Award. I currently serve in a leadership capacity to the Southeast Electric Transportation Regional Initiative, Georgia's Electric Mobility Innovation Alliance, Drive Electric Florida, Plug-in North Carolina, South Carolina's Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative, and Drive Electric Tennessee. Prior to my work with transportation electrification, I led Warren Wilson College's Environmental Leadership Center and was recognized as North Carolina's 2007 Environmental Educator of the Year. I received a BA in psychology from Skidmore College and a master's in arts and science from the University of North Carolina at Asheville. My resume is attached as Exhibit SC1 to this testimony.
And Mr. Cross, do you have experience evaluating how transportation electrification will impact utility grid and resource planning?
Yes, my colleagues at SACE and I have been and continue to be active in all electric transportation related utility dockets across the Southeast, including in rate cases and integrated resource planning dockets. We publish reports and white papers on topics that include the regional electric transportation market, consumer benefits from the switch to electric vehicles, the need for robust distribution planning, and the grid impact of medium and heavy-duty vehicle electrification.
Chair Belzer, at this time, I would request that Mr. Cross be qualified as an expert in transportation electrification policy and planning.
The witness being offered as an expert. Is there any voir dire or questions from any of the parties concerning his qualifications? Hearing none, we will accept Mr. Cross as an expert in transportation electrification policy and planning.
Mr. Cross, have you prepared a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes.
Please read your summary to the Commission.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Belzer and members of the Commission. My name is Stan Cross, and the purpose of my testimony is to present the comments previously filed by South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and Vote Solar in this proceeding. Those comments provided recommendations to the Commission on the issues laid out in the order establishing this proceeding and are attached as exhibits SC2 and SC3 to this testimony. My primary observations regarding the regulatory challenges and opportunities associated with transportation electrification, set out in greater detail in the comments, are that a comprehensive planning framework will be necessary to ensure that South Carolina fully realizes the benefits of electric car, truck, and bus adoption. Right now, the EV industry is barreling full steam ahead and has the potential to unlock numerous benefits for South Carolina. It is possible that the biggest barrier to realizing these benefits could be the regulated utility sector, which, rather than setting the stage for smart, efficient growth, risks becoming a bottleneck for the private sector's advancements. Effective Commission oversight is critical to spur smart utility planning and ensure that the full benefits of transportation electrification are realized by both ratepayers and the public at large. To this end, the Commission should require utilities to file transportation electrification plans, or TEPs, which are comprehensive utility-specific planning documents that provide a detailed analysis of EV-related forecasts, needs, and impacts, and associated utility actions necessary to facilitate efficient and effective growth. Once reviewed by the public and approved by the Commission, TEPs can become useful tools to inform other utility dockets, such as IRPs, direct grid planning activities, and provide context for discrete EV program applications. The Commission has also heard a lot in this hearing about different rate structures, why demand charges and price signals make sense for certain categories of EVs, but not others. Given the diverse needs in the EV marketplace, TEPs can also provide a forum to develop an appropriate suite of rate structures for different use cases, rather than dealing with these issues rate by rate or proceeding by proceeding. But simply, fleets, customers charging at home, drivers using public fast chargers, all have different needs, uses, and behave differently. So you need different rate structures to meet driver and system needs across these different applications. There's no question that South Carolina has some catching up to do on transportation electrification, but growth is happening. From July 2022 through June 2023, passenger EV sales and charging station deployments in South Carolina both grew by 55%. In the same 12-month time frame, the state saw a staggering 1,024% increase in private EV-related manufacturing investment, following national trends and a focus on EV manufacturing by Governor McMaster. With EVs approaching 10% market share nationally, automakers aiming to end gas car sales by 2035, and billions of dollars of federal funding flowing to states and consumers to accelerate the transition, now is the time to put an effective transportation electrification planning framework in place. By doing so, this Commission can support smart EV growth in South Carolina that benefits all residents in the state. That concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Chair Belzer, Mr. Cross is now available for cross-examination and questions from the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy. Parties, questions for the witness? Hearing none. Commissioners, questions for the witness? Commissioner Justin Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, sir. Excuse me. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I appreciate your testimony. It sounds really, really good, and I want to get into it a little bit. You gave a summary and a high-level view of what you think is appropriate for transportation and electrification planning. What I'm trying to get a better feel for is the specific why, but maybe more than one why, as to why the commission should require the utilities to present that document to us for review. Like, what tangible, quantifiable benefit will ratepayers at every level receive from such an exercise?
Commissioner, during the testimony over the last 2 days, I think we've heard consistently from utilities, private sector, that this transition is coming and it's coming quickly, and we need to plan for it. And that it's going to bring new load, and how we manage that load will determine whether or not this transition is efficient and effective, or whether or not it's inefficient and costly. And so I think we're at a moment right now where that planning can help us ensure the efficient and effective transition. And let me give an example of why we are honing in on the plan as being something, a transportation electrification plan as being something separate from the IRP. We've been talking a lot here about resilience planning as an example, and how are we going to ensure the safe evacuation and return of folks driving an electric vehicle. And for 3 years, I was part of a Department of Energy funded project that looked at this very question for North and South Carolina. The project was run by E4 Carolinas and involved all the utilities, state DOTs, industry, and professionals like myself in the space. And for 3 years, we looked at what needed to happen to make alternative fuel infrastructure resilient in the Carolinas. That plan was completed a year ago. And it looked at, we're all in the case for this particular proceeding, it looked at all the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, when infrastructure is in threat of storm issues and needs to be hardened, and where infrastructure is needed to enable safe evacuation. It looked at strategies for how we could do things such as have mobile trailers of DC fast chargers with generators that could be that could be located at way stations and rest stops along the highway corridors to facilitate evacuation. All of this was put into layers of GIS mapping to help inform planning going forward. Information like that isn't going to come forth in an IRP. It's not going to come to light. The existence of it isn't going to become part of the conversation. If we have a transportation electrification plan, then information like that and the experts who help create it can be brought into the fold to help inform a lot of the questions that we've been asking here, over the last 2 days. Additionally, a why is because IRPs are utility by utility, territory by territory. As we've been talking about, right, electric vehicles are loads on wheels. They are moving, and they are moving across territories. And we do not have a comprehensive look through the IRPs of how South Carolina as a state is going to facilitate equitable access to the benefits of electric transportation. Or, for example, how the state is going to manage across the state the travel of medium and heavy duty vehicles, how it's going to manage people moving through the state and coming to the state from other states. All of these questions aren't going to be able to be adequately addressed utility by utility, territory by territory. We need a higher view of how this all comes together. And then, a final why would be, I think, just reinforcing what we heard from the gentleman from Duke Energy, that a lot of the most challenging questions to address and challenges to address with transportation electrification are at that local level where IRPs do not go. And even though we understand that at that local level, things are changing and it's very fluid, we still need to be recognizing that at that local level is where the warehouses are and the distribution centers are, where fleets are electrifying, where public entities like local governments are electrifying their fleets, where neighborhoods are being built that really fit the demographic of EV consumers right now, where we're seeing load growth beginning at that residential level. So there's a lot of opportunity in a transportation electrification plan to hear more broadly from experts in the space on everything from resilience to equitable access, ways to really look at things at a more local level, and ways to look at things across territories so we have a better view of the state as a whole.
What do you mean by equitable access to electric transportation?
So as we've heard from the utilities, particularly in the conversation of the role of the utility in owning and operating assets, we recognize that currently most EV charging infrastructure is centered around where electric vehicles are being purchased. So we have this sort of self-feeding loop where folks are buying EVs is where the infrastructure is, but where the infrastructure is also supporting people's ability to buy electric vehicles. And so in order to have more equitable access, to have rural communities not left behind, as your fellow commissioner was mentioning regarding the broadband issue, to make sure that everybody has access to not only owning an EV, but also access to electric school buses that are cleaner for their children, electric transit buses that are cleaner for their community, electric delivery vehicles that are cleaner for their community. We need to make sure that infrastructure is distributed equitably to support that growth, equitably in the sense of geographically across the state. And that's currently not happening, right? And so we need to be thinking about what the barriers are to that and how we look to overcome those barriers. In this moment of federal funding flowing is a prime time to be thinking about that, because one of the challenges the industry has faced is the fact that infrastructure is costly, right? And so putting it in places where it might be ahead of the curve as a way to spur electrification, as opposed to where the market can currently support it, is a capital question. And with all the capital coming from the federal government right now, it opens up the opportunity to bring charging where it hasn't been brought before. So that's what I mean by equitable access, ensuring that charging gives the opportunity for all South Carolinians to participate in this new emerging technology.
I appreciate you sharing that with me. The reason I asked that question is I'm trying to apply my lived experience to your testimony. And as a owner of an EV, and I drive it practically everywhere, specifically I had an experience the last 2 weeks where I was traveling to a place, a rural area, where people were gathering. And it's all fun and it's all love, but they were picking at me for driving an EV. And so to the extent that we want equitable access, how do you know that folks that live in rural areas actually want to buy an EV? Is there some study or what informs that decision?
That's a really good question. And I join you as being an EV driver. I've been driving an EV for 10 years and I only drive an EV. I haven't had a gas car for 2 years. My wife and I are exclusive EV drivers as a family. And I'm not presuming that anybody wants to drive an EV. The point I'm making is that as an EV driver, okay, and I am moving across the state and across the region. I'm driving to South Carolina for work and for pleasure. And as I do, having access to EV charging allows me to move through the state. So there's that piece of it. From a local South Carolinian perspective, I think as EVs continue to be brought to market, as different types of EVs like pickup trucks and SUVs come to market, more consumers are going to be interested in them, whether they're rural or urban, right? We're having a greater diversity of vehicles coming to market, and that's going to bring a greater diversity of consumers forward. The surveys that have been done on consumers have been consistent. And they've been finding, surveys done by groups like Consumer Reports, have been finding that over a third of consumers are definitely or seriously considering buying an EV for their next vehicle, right? So we're seeing from the survey data a lot of consumer interest. I cannot attest to whether that's specific rural versus urban or any other demographic, but just that there is growing interest amongst consumers for the technology. We need to make sure that those consumers who want to buy are being supported with the infrastructure that they need. A lot of that is a private sector play, but the planning to make sure that the utility can provide for that increasing load and do so in a way that's efficient and effective is what we're looking for when we talk about a transportation electrification plan.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Do you not think that some of what you want to do in a transportation electrification plan could be resolved or addressed in an IRP? Maybe not everything, but some of the issues that you've raised, could they not be addressed in an IRP?
We haven't seen them adequately addressed in an IRP yet. So I don't want to speculate too much on what might be able to be done in the future. We're more looking at what's happened so far, and we don't feel that the IRP process has provided a level of both granularity, talking about getting down to that local level, nor has it provided a venue where experts who might not be present in an IRP docket could be present to provide really valuable insights and information for commissioners and to the planning effort.
Okay. I think this is my last question for you, and I appreciate you indulging me and explaining your position or unpacking your position, I should say. Do you think that it's possible if the commission adopted your position and we required a transportation electrification plan and we've moved forward some of this this build out with transportation electrification infrastructure, is it anything you could tell me to alleviate some of my fear that we may make a large investment, utilities, meaning ratepayers, will make a large investment in electric transportation infrastructure, and yet those charging stations would go mostly unused? Is it possible for us to go down this road and everything we thought would be true, the studies, the surveys, the trends don't pan out, and we have much slower growth than anticipated? And then when we look back in hindsight, we say, well, we made the best decision with the information available at the time.
I think that's a really important question to ask along the journey here, without a doubt. And what we're advocating for is not that the utilities invest in the infrastructure that may or may not be needed, but to plan for what is likely to come and be able to respond efficiently and effectively when and if it does, right? So we're not talking about spending ratepayer dollars in order to build out a bunch of infrastructure that may or may not be needed. That's not what we're talking about. And there's going to be there's going to be challenges within the planning. There's going to be questions that can't be answered. There's going to be things that are still going to be unknown. But as we continue to move down this path of electric vehicle adoption, both on the light duty side with cars, but now increasingly on the medium and heavy duty side with vans, buses, and trucks, we do have some understanding of where the likely load is going to be for some of these deployments. And we can begin to plan for that. Just as one more example of where I think the planning can save time and money is, we have the NEVI program, right? So that's the National EV Infrastructure Program that's delivering $7.5 billion of infrastructure across the country. Of that, $5 billion of it is formula funding going to states to build out DC fast charging infrastructure across highway systems. South Carolina is receiving $70 million. That will fund approximately 70 of these DC fast charging hubs across the state. Each one of these hubs will be required to provide a minimum of 600 kilowatts of simultaneous power to charge EVs at that site. That rollout is going to be in every different utilities territory. It's going to be in rural areas. It's going to be in urban areas. It's going to be every 50 miles along the highway system. That's what the requirement is. And so when we're doing rollouts like that, if we had already done the transportation electrification planning, if we had already brought together our understanding of resilience needs, our understanding of capacity to the degree that we can understand it, our understanding of how we open up access, if all of that was present, then as the State Department of Transportation looks at the map and looks at where these stations are going to go, they would be able to massage those locations to be more cost effective and be able to be deployed more efficiently. But we don't have that plan right now, right? And we're going to learn all of the answers we could already have through the process of deployment, which runs the risk of making things more inefficient and more costly. So I think the planning that we're asking for is to avoid exactly what you're speaking to, right? Is to avoid unnecessary expenditure, and is to make sure that the dollars spent are done so as efficiently and effectively as we move forward.
That makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you believe this, but I tend to believe that seeing is believing. Actions speak louder than words, all those type of old cliches and adages. Is there a state that you can point to that has implemented some of your proposals and currently are experiencing the fruit from the effort?
Not here in the Southeast. This is something that we're advocating for in front of every commission in the region. If we look outside of the Southeast, yes, there have been planning efforts in New England states. There have been planning efforts in the West Coast, in California, Oregon, and Washington. There's been planning processes across state lines that are all bearing fruit when we think about how these federal funds and other investments by the private sector are being leveraged to enable that connectivity, right? So that you can get across a state, so you can get from state to state in an EV. So yes, there are examples of where the planning is bearing fruit, but not examples that are in our regulated utility environment here in the Southeast that would be directly applicable. I think South Carolina has the opportunity here to do planning and in so sort of differentiate itself a little bit and lead here in the Southeast. And that has a potential secondary impact. So right now in the region, there is a lot of competition to attract EV manufacturing and related supply chain jobs. The region, Southeast, has attracted 40% of all the nation's investment in EV and related manufacturing so far. It is becoming a hotbed. And the governor recognizes this, and that's why he is organizing his agencies to really go after, this manufacturing investment. And as companies look to expand and foreign companies look to relocate here in the United States, they're looking for the states that have the right policy and regulatory mechanisms in place to ensure a robust market for their product. And so South Carolina having a transportation electrification plan, showing that sort of coordinated utility effort and being able to point to, kind of a really focused effort to build out infrastructure smartly, efficiently, and effectively can also be leveraged to make the state more competitive for that investment that's happening in the industry.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Is there anything else you think I should know or we should know? I really enjoyed our discussion.
Well, you already drive an electric vehicle, so you know how great that experience is. So, no.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioners, further questions for this witness?
Chair Bouncer?
Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you. Mr. Cross, good to see you and good to have you here today and good to have the expertise from the Southeast perspective.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
I want to start with something really basic because I have some of the same questions that Commissioner Williams had. And so that basic question is, what's in a transportation electrification plan?
The transportation electrification plan would bring into, let me start this way. A transportation plan is two things. It's a process and it's a product, right? So the process would open up an opportunity for the commission to bring experts that represent a wider swath of the space than currently shows up in something like an IRP. As I was saying before, it would broaden the conversation to be looking at some of these resilience questions and other questions that are really important for us to be considering. So the process would allow a more robust dialogue to occur.
Understood.
As far as the product, it would show what needs to happen and what is happening statewide across utility territories to ensure that there is that connectivity of both investment being identified as needed and also the sort of preparation for that investment to be made. So in an IRP, right, we're looking at those load forecasts, and as both the gentleman from Dominion and Duke pointed out well, is where we're making sure that the system is going to be able to meet that load. That's important, right? And we're talking about obviously everything under the sun when we're looking at that IRP process. To drill down in a electric transportation plan, we would be able to look at where the likely local impacts are, looking at how the technologies are emerging. For example, there's a significant amount of federal funding to electrify ports. The Port of Charleston is going to be drawing down a significant amount of that funding. They're going to be looking to electrify drayage trucks and other tools that are related to the port that then go out to warehouses and distribution centers, right? So as that funding is being drawn down, we begin to see this load that's going to be coming to that area. But we also want to recognize that, again, it's mobile and it's going to start spreading out from that point. And so the transportation electrification plan would let us get to that granularity, and then it would feed up into the IRP with better data and better information. So it's both bringing the experts forward to inform the plan, and it's making sure we got that granularity. And then thirdly, it's a plan that has all the utilities in the room at the same time, kind of looking at this issue, not just in their own territory, but also how their territories are connecting and where, issues may be on those edges.
This may not be a question you can answer, but do you believe we have statutory authority to do that?
You're right. I will not answer that, not being a lawyer.
Okay. I mean, as a planner, and as someone who understands the value of what you talked about, I'm eager to see this happen. But as a commissioner, I'm perplexed as to how the next step would be taken from the Public Service Commission's perspective. I could see some other entities involvement. Commissioner Williams asked you for other examples, but I think in your, and you talked about them more nationally. Are there examples of, could you talk about what is happening in other states in the Southeast? I think your testimony mentioned Virginia and perhaps some others. Are there lessons learned from our peers?
There are some lessons that we can learn in Virginia, right? So that's where, when we think about the region here where, the most work has been being done on this question about planning. So there are lessons that we can draw down from Virginia. I think there's also lessons that we can be drawing right now about this challenge of the deployment of these NEVI funds and what some state DOTs are struggling with as they are looking at a map, trying to figure out where to put these assets, and are needing to write RFPs for private sector to come in and bid on the assets without knowing whether or to what degree utility upgrades are going to be necessary, what they're going to be, and what that's going to cost, which will then impact the total cost of the project, which then impacts the private sector's bid on the project, which then impacts the state's allocation of those NEVI funds. And so we're seeing this sort of protracted process that's occurring because information is really difficult to come by. And I appreciate the having deployed millions of dollars of charging infrastructure myself, I know how challenging it is to understand what's happening at a local level. But when we're looking at the scaling up of deploying charging infrastructure, which the NEVI program is forcing us to confront, we are realizing that when we're trying to put charging infrastructure, we've heard in these testimonies that, from the private sector folks, that location matters. And that's very, very true. But whether a charging asset is placed at exit 3, 4, or 5 might not matter so much, right? But if exit 4 has plenty of capacity and 3 and 5 don't, then exit 4 can become the priority. So that capacity can actually drive the decision process of where those assets go. So we're starting to see that with this NEVI program that, again, is deploying 600 kilowatts worth of charging at each site. So I think that's proving as an example of, again, where if we had done this planning already, and if we had some greater understanding of where three-phase power is available, where capacity is certainly available now for these assets, the state DOTs would be able to be doing their work more efficiently and effectively, and the private sector would have a better view.
So we were talking about transportation electrification planning, but at some point I think you shifted into kind of load capacity planning. And are those one and the same? Talk about load capacity planning for me, and how they are different or the same entities.
The two are not the same, but information about capacity can feed into the transportation electrification plan. Imagine it as a sort of layer of information that can be brought into the plan to help inform where infrastructure can be located with minimal impact on the grid, minimal upgrades to the grid necessary. So they are not the same, but they can work together to make sure that at least at this sort of stage of deployment, that we're targeting where it's most cost effective to install these assets. Because right now we have some leeway, we have some choice about where these go and where there is opportunity and where there's the ability to meet load are places that we can be prioritizing along with other factors. So that understanding capacity, understanding load, helps inform that transportation electrification plan and helps identify where locations are ripe for that public fast charger deployment. But there's also the issue of fleet deployment. And as we've heard, some companies have already initiated or initiating plans to electrify their fleets. Others are not yet. There's private sector players, there's private sector fleet operators, and there's public fleet operators. There's your city fleets, your state agency fleets. And so that's another layer that goes into the transportation planning, is starting to understand where these fleets are located. And those that are on path to electrify or are already starting to electrify, that can be fed into the prioritization of where you're looking to potentially build out additional capacity. But you're also paying attention in the transportation electrification plan to where those other fleets exist and bringing them into the conversation so you start to understand proactively what their planning process is and whether or not they are looking to move in the next 1, 3, 5, 10 years in that direction. That's information that's otherwise difficult to get if you don't have a forum where people are contributing that information and they feel that there's a place where they can bring that information to be heard.
It strikes me as you're talking that one of the hurdles for transportation electrification planning is the idea of doing it every 3 years. But it also strikes me that we are looking at a window of opportunity that is short-lived and may not, it may not be a marriage. It may be, it could be a relatively short-term 10-year kind of time frame that we need this kind of analysis until we're able to confidently move forward. I see you shaking your head. Would you comment on that?
Yes, I think that we have a tremendous amount to learn. All of us do. And as we learn, we are going to get better and more adept at doing this work. And I totally believe that we will get to a point where electrifying transportation becomes no more complicated than when we air conditioned the built environment. But we're not there now, right? Now it is a very complex endeavor. There are a tremendous amount of business models. We heard just a little bit about that in the testimony here, but from the infrastructure company perspective, there's a lot of different ways in which they're trying to solve a whole variety of different problems. Every utility is responding to this challenge in their own unique and different way. And EV consumers are adopting in, there's some patterns, but it's basically random, right? Fleets that are adopting are basically random when we look at it geographically. So there's a lot of those challenges that we haven't experienced before that I think once we do, to your point, I think that, my hope is that someday I'm out of a job and these vehicles are being electrified and we're addressing the national security issues of our oil dependence. We're addressing the challenge of climate change from transportation emissions, and we're saving consumers and ratepayer dollars by shifting to a more price stable, lower cost fuel for transportation. The question is, how do we get there, and how do we get there efficiently and effectively? And the planning can help us do that.
Which is more essential? Doing transportation electrification planning at the statewide level, or offering load capacity maps?
The planning is more important. And if we do the planning, I believe the benefit of having more visibility into capacity will become evident.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed getting to know you and your expertise.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioners, further questions for the witness? Hearing none. Ms. Clancy, any redirect?
No redirect.
Mr. Cross, thank you for your testimony today and your appearance. We certainly appreciate your thoughts on this subject. Thank you for participating. You may be excused.
Appreciate it.
Ms. Clancy, does that complete your case?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. I think we're to the Office of Regulatory Staff now.
Yes, Madam Chair. ORS calls O'Neill Morgan.
Mr. Morgan, if you'd raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Could you please state your name for the record?
O'Neill Morgan.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed as a senior engineer in the Utility Rates and Services Division of the Office of Regulatory Staff.
And Mr. Morgan, did you prepare or cause to be prepared 4 pages of direct testimony pre-filed in this proceeding on September 21st, 2023?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
No, I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today as those posed in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, ORS asks that the pre-filed direct testimony of O'Neill Morgan be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Morgan will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Thank you. Mr. Morgan, in your direct testimony, did you adopt as Exhibit OOM1 comments previously filed in this docket by ORS on July 27th, 2023?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to Exhibit OOM1?
No, I do not.
Madam Chair, ORS would move Exhibit OOM1 into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
Mr. Morgan's Exhibit OOM1 that was filed with his pre-filed direct testimony will be marked for identification as hearing Exhibit 1. Any objection? Hearing none, and received into the evidence of this case.
Mr. Morgan, has ORS developed an electrification program framework that should guide electrification programs?
Yes, we did.
Would you please describe the electrification framework that ORS developed?
Yes. The framework is comprised of 7 elements as follows. 1, utilities should provide reliable and high-quality utility services at the least cost to the customer in compliance with all applicable state and federal rules and regulations. 2, utility programs should be accessible to customers regardless of socioeconomic status. 3, utility investment in electrification programs and cost recovery arising therefrom should reflect applicable cost causation principles and mitigate cross-subsidization to the greatest extent possible. 4, Utility investment in electrification programs should adequately address timing and costs associated with the utility's interconnection process, including changes in system load, conditions that would require broader investments in transmission and distribution systems. 5. Utility investment in electrification programs should yield quantifiable net customer benefits and should be demonstrable, cost-effective using industry standard cost effectiveness testing. 6. Utility investment in electrification programs should align with the utility's core business and leverage the utility's economies of scale to the benefit of all customers. And finally, 7. Electrification programs should be identifiable, tracked, and recorded in a clear and transparent manner that can be easily reviewed and compared to initial estimates.
Mr. Morgan, did ORS also develop a list of best practices that should inform any electrification program?
Yes, we did.
Could you describe those best practices, please?
Yes, those best practices include the following. 1. The utility should accommodate electrification driven by customer demand, as illustrated by objective and reliable data. Such data would include rates of EV participation, adaptation, system load conditions, impacts to IRP models, and identifiable and quantifiable system participant benefits and costs. 2. Utility investment and programs should facilitate market competition and minimize ratepayer risks and costs. 3. Utility investment and programs should establish a clear definition of point of delivery such that the customer and utility cost responsibility is identified clearly. 4. The utility should have a robust load management plan before committing ratepayer investment to build electrification infrastructure. This would include development of demand-side management resources, time of use rates, or other rate design. 5. The utility should pursue and exhaust all available state and federal funding sources for infrastructure development prior to the commitment of ratepayer funds. And finally, 6. The proposed utility investment and programs should strive to enable customer choice of electric vehicle supply equipment. B. Reflect the utility's comprehensive electrification and load management plan and be consistent with the IRP. Focus on all applicable state and federal electrification goals. D. Facilitate improve grid management. E. Allow for the integration of distributed energy resources to maintain or improve the reliability and resiliency of the grid. F. Be transparent, measurable, flexible, and future forward to minimize customer risk. G. Benefit the total system through the downward pressure on rates through increased volumetric kWh sales. H. Utilize rate design as an effective tool to mitigate potential system capacity issues. And last, be consistent with electric industry trends and best practices and incorporate learnings from previously administered or ongoing pilot programs.
Finally, Mr. Morgan, does ORS have a position on the application of traditional demand charges to EV charging?
Yes, we do. The proliferation of public EV charging stations funded by commercial and industrial customers of the utility could be hampered by existing demand charge policy. Demand charges can be a significant barrier to the deployment of public EV charging stations. Having charging power can cause demand charges to comprise the majority of a charging site owes monthly electric bill. Utilities should evaluate demand charges alternatives to reduce financial barriers for CNI customers to deploy public EV charging station. In doing so, however, utilities should also ensure that EV charging is not immune from contributing to system costs.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Madam Chair, Mr. Morgan is available for questioning.
Thank you. Questions for this witness from the parties? Hearing none. Commissioners? Good afternoon, Mr. Morgan. I'm going to start.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Morgan, you identified some, I'm going to call them planks, but different areas for an electrification program framework. How did ORS develop those?
Well, we understand the various statutes that we have to adhere to, and we look at the different states regulation outside of our state and what would entail in a effective and successful electrification program and tailor that to meet our local needs in South Carolina.
So there was a lot of research, a lot of discussion, or
yes, research and discussions.
Discussion with other state agencies, and how about utilities? Did ORS involve? Did ORS engage a stakeholder group in any manner?
If they did, I was not privy.
I'm just curious. I'm just trying to understand.
I was not privy to that.
And how about the best practices which you've recommended? Was that the same type process?
Same type of process.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your being here today and your testimony.
Thank you.
Commissioner Caston?
Some very quick questions. On page 4, I think, of your exhibit, you talk about relative to EV potential loads. You state, such EV-driven capital projects should be incorporated into a utilities IRP process.
Yes.
Do you or ORS believe that utilities should develop and file separate transportation electrification plans, or is incorporating projected demands in IRPs and T&D plans adequate?
Well, as it stands today, we believe that the IRP provides sufficient area to look at that additional growth. So we are not asking the utility at this time to do a separate or a specific electrification plan outside of the IRP. We're not sure looking down the road if that is something that we would look into, but as it stands today, we believe the IRP provides all the information that we need to look at this growth.
All righty, thank you. And on page 8 of that exhibit, you state commission should establish defined guardrails governing the scope of utilities involvement in the transition to EV transportation. I'm assuming these guardrails, this is primarily referring to the EV charging market. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you state the EV charging stations have no place in a utilities rate base. Is this why and where ORS believes those guardrails should come into play?
Yes, we believe that it's a competitive market right now as it regards to EV chargers, and there's enough competition that would allow for the adoption of EVs. And with, as was stated before, there is a lot of federal and state funding, and we think it's best that the utility continue to focus on their core business in ensuring that they provide reliable, high quality services to the customers without getting involved in owning and operating
Alrighty,
EV
thank you.
chargers.
And finally, and I think I saw you here yesterday. You were here yesterday for this.
Yes, I was.
And relative to, I guess, should there be involvement in the EV market? Should it be no involvement, limited involvement? And I think maybe Duke and Dominion, I can't recall, both said something to the effect, I think, that we shouldn't say none, because there may be those cases where it may be appropriate. Is OR saying they should have zero involvement, or if any involvement, limited case by case? I mean, what's your thought there?
And we agree with the utility on that aspect. We're not saying there should be none, but limited and based on case-by-case basis. And again, bear in mind that we will evaluate those case-by-case basis using the cost causation principle and ensure that the costs are not subsidized by non-participants. But we acknowledge that there might be cases where the private sector cannot or decides not to participate in a location that the utility may have to step in. So it's not full stop no, but preferably no.
All right, I understand. Thank you so much, Mr. O'Neill. I appreciate it. I mean,
Thank you.
Mr. Morgan, and I have no more questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, further questions for this witness?
Chair Belser?
Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Mr. Morgan, on this.
Good to see you too.
Thank you. Would you talk more about what the guardrails might be that the commission should establish regarding the scope of the utilities involvement?
Well, we have not established or dig deep into those guardrails, but just to state our position on the record that we do not believe that the EV chargers ownership and operation should be a place where the utility offer assistance in the adoption of the electrification of transportation.
Okay. What role, if any, from your perspective, should there be in providing load capacity maps to support good decision making regarding locations of DC fast charging?
Well,
Do we need them?
what I will say to that question is the utility, they are the experts and they have many tools at their disposal to locate the best appropriate areas in which to provide that load, looking at their studies that they have done, as mentioned. So I could not say whether or not capacity maps is one way or another the best way to do that.
In doing the research for your framework and your best management practices, is that something that you discovered in looking at other states?
No, we did not focus on that aspect.
How important do you think managed charging of EVs are to the state's electric grid, and why?
Well, managed charging is important to the grid to ensure that costs are curtailed for the utility as well as the customer.
Is that from the perspective of avoiding additional peak load?
Yes, and also cost to the customer as well.
How important is it for utilities to develop a comprehensive grid planning and load management approach to EV charging in South Carolina? And I guess by that I mean, you know, utilities have their, maybe I want to ask that from a collective perspective. You know, they're each looking independently, but as one person testified, as many people testified, this is load that's moving throughout the state. Is there a need to look at it comprehensively?
Well, I think that is very important. The utility is required to provide reliable, high quality services to customers when they need it. So it is imperative that the utility does do the appropriate study and preparation for this load growth in order to serve their customers in a way that customers are satisfied with the service. And not being prepared, we don't want a situation where there is a number of unforeseen blockouts where the utility cannot provide that load. So it's very important for the utility to study and understand the potential load growth and prepare for the potential load growth.
I guess I'm asking the question about within the state, how important it is to look at impact because of this portable need. And but as I'm asking that, I'm also thinking about the fact that the need, like of a fleet, there'll be substantial need that may start out in one balancing area and end up in another balancing area. But there will also be fleets that will come to a home location and recharge. But it just strikes me that it's a very complicated coordination amongst utilities that we haven't faced before. And so I'm asking if, and maybe you know of a circumstance that where our utilities have worked together in the past on this kind of load sharing. Maybe it's something that's a part of SEAM, but is there a need to look broadly through an umbrella kind of look at what all of the needs are at one time with the needs that are moving around the state?
We're in a situation right now where we're seeing the improvements in technology, in particular EVs, and as I generally say to my sons, the jobs that you're going to do may not even exist today, right? In preparation for this case, I saw a developer of or a manufacturer of EV vehicles out of Atlanta, Derek Bailey, and he was talking about designing electric vehicles that has no need for a charging station, where the vehicle itself, as it drives, it will continue to provide charge to the existing batteries. So we are in a situation right now that things are changing rapidly, and we're here today, talking about, as Commissioner Williams say, we with the information today, we're trying to make the best decision and the best plans in front of us. But in another 5 years, you might have a situation where you have electric vehicles have no need for charging stations. So it's a difficult situation, and we're doing the best we can. And I believe we are coming together at this time to provide information to the Commission so that they can meet their statutory requirement and present the information that they believe best suits South Carolina at this time.
Thank you. And well said to your sons.
Yes.
I'm sure that's even more true today than when I had young people in my house.
Thank you.
My last question has to do with your comments about demand charges. And I think what you said, and it's getting hard to remember, to admit, after a long day, that generally ORS is not supportive of demand charges. Was that true?
We did not make that statement, but
Okay.
we understand there that demand charges can be a barrier. So utilities must look into alternatives, but again, ensuring that the causation principle is adhered to, as well as ensuring that there is no cost subsidization across non-participants.
Thank you for clarifying and correcting me. We've heard some testimony that demand charges might, that the importance of them, particularly as adoption increases, did ORS look at or think about kind of the impact of demand charges at this nascent level versus more broad adoption?
Not in the details you're mentioning, but it's finding that balance, and as it was stated by other presenters yesterday, demand charges might be something that initially it is high, but as the volume increases, it may reduce those demand charges, or you can set the rates in such a way that a high volumetric rate, which take in consideration the demand charges. So we're just asking the utility to present something to us, and we will evaluate and see the best option for South Carolina residents.
Mr. Morgan, thank you very much. I appreciate all the answers.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioners, any further questions for Mr. Morgan?
Madam Chair, I have one question.
Commissioner Irvin?
Thank you. Mr. Morgan, do you think it would be beneficial to have a stakeholders working group to work with the investor-owned utilities to plan for EV adoption in South Carolina?
I think one took place was done before in terms of EVs, but if my knowledge is not correct, and that if the commission feels that there is one should be had, then we have no problem with participating, but I believe that one was done.
I was thinking about an ongoing process, and so that might be something we can consider at the appropriate time, but seems to be some interest in that perhaps, so we'll say that for another time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Irvin. Any further questions for the witness? Hearing none. Mr. Torrey, any redirect?
No redirect.
Mr. Morgan, thank you for your testimony today. We appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you. You may be excused.
Okay.
Mr. Torrey?
That concludes the ORS case, Madam Chair.
Well, we've reached the end, so to speak. I want to thank all the parties, and we're going to put out something here. I don't know if it's needed. I know that I think all the parties that are here pre-filed or filed comments, and some of the parties had filed responsive comments, and I think most of those have been adopted in the testimonies today. I'm just concerned that there may be some comments in the dockets in response to earlier directive orders of the commission that may not have been introduced. So to that extent, would there be any objection to the commission taking judicial notice of any other comments that might be filed in the docket? Okay, hearing none, we will take notice of those comments as well. I will say that I appreciated the testimony of the witnesses because they certainly clarified some points and thoughts that I had had. So it was very, very, very beneficial to me as a single commissioner to hear, or at least have a representative of the parties filing comments here to explain and clarify and just expand on those. So I found that very helpful. But so we certainly appreciate all the work that the parties have put into these comments and in being here for the last, day and a half. So thank you very much. And if there's nothing further to come before the commission at this time, I'm not asking for briefs because we got comments galore, so that's why we're not going that route. But just in case you're wondering, but if there's nothing more, we'll close this hearing and we'll be studying some more and notifying y'all of a decision at some future point. So thank you very much. Safe travels as you leave, and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.